impossible to overlook and beyond worth mentioning. The secret and hidden influence over the most prominent groups and people of so-called Black society can rightfully be attributed to a small group of individuals. Whether it be within the degrees of Freemasonry, academia, or entertainment, these people always seem to have a hidden hand behind the curtain. Not worth mentioning is the supposed nationality of this specific group of people, who are only said to consist of just around 2% of the national population. However, their influence over the so-called African American voice far supersedes this tiny percentage. Mentioning this justifiable fact could easily get an unjustified label slapped on anyone who finds this fact worth mentioning. As mentioned in previous episodes, Zionists played a key role in the founding and operation of the NAACP. Joel Spingarn, a wealthy Jewishman born on third base, was the organization's first chairman. His brother, Arthur Spingarn, was president of the NAACP for over 20 years. Henry Moskowitz, co-founder of the NAACP, was a Romanian Jew. William E. Walling, the son of wealthy slave owners, married Anna Strunsky, a Russian Jew, and both were avowed socialists. Another fact not worth mentioning: communism and Zionism work hand in hand, for it was the conditions in Russia created by the Bolshevik communists that ultimately paved the road for the creation of the Zionist state in Palestine. The leaders of Bolshevism, Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, and Joseph Stalin, were all Russian Jews who changed their surnames to Slavic titles to further conceal their identity. As was the case with many immigrants of the late 19th and early 20th century, many were communist Jews with secret ties to Russia. These distinctly Marxist Europeans found their prize pony in the black cause when they decided to hitch it to their communist bandwagon under the veil of equality. At its foundation, these groups were attempting to push a welfare philosophy to the black community through the perpetuation of communist and socialist ideals, in which government reliance would bridge the gap between Jim Crow, wealth, and equality by essentially replacing personal responsibility with government responsibility, increasing government intervention in everyone's life, and eliminating the idea of personal wealth, which honestly seems like a crazy idea, especially considering who's behind it. Needless to say, the NAACP not only had Zionist origins, it also had Marxist origins. So one shouldn't be surprised how comfortable W.E.B. Du Bois was amongst European communists, because he was one himself. Especially following his Hegelian initiation in Germany at the University of Berlin, W.E.B.T. Du Bois was the perfect face for their newly rebranded National Negro Committee, which now had its very own Negro and new name, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This particular group of Marxist whites were specifically looking for black talent in the flavor of secular radicalism rather than faith-based conservatism, which meant they preferred the ideology of Willie to that of Booker T. Washington. The founding and financing of the NAACP was almost entirely a Jewish enterprise. Although W.E.B. Du Bois is mentioned on the list of founders, he was nothing more than a token black face for the organization, with no authority over any decisions. Holding the official title of Director of Publicity and Research, Even his writings in the crisis required a Jewish overseer. As was the case with most social organizations, the true authority rested within the board of directors, and the same would be the case for the NAACP. Jacob Bilikoff, an acclaimed Russian Jew noted for his contribution to Jewish charitable groups, became one of the NAACP's most famed board members. Due to his young age, Bilikoff was considered an up-and-coming contender on the yarmulke charts. Stephen Wise, a Hungarian Jew and rabbi, was also appointed to the board by its members. Stephen Wise was not an Orthodox rabbi, but a Reformed rabbi who, along with other Jewish leadership, lobbied President Woodrow Wilson in endorsement of the Balfour Declaration in 1917 and the creation of a Zionist state in Palestine. Jacob Schiff, one of the wealthiest and most significant Jewish aristocrats in American history, was also on the board of directors. Born into German Jewish nobility to one of the oldest rabbinical bloodlines in Europe, Schiff headed a New York banking empire from Wall Street, presiding over National City Bank of New York, Equitable Life Assurance Company, Wells Fargo, and Union Pacific Railroad. His father Moses had been personal broker for Nathan and Salomon Rothschild in Frankfurt, Germany. And according to the Bavarian Grapevine Archive of Judengasse, the Rothschilds and the Schiff families even shared the same home back in Frankfurt. After the death of Moses, Jacob moved to New York and joined fellow German Jewish bankers Abraham Kuhn and Solomon Loeb, eventually running one of the most profitable investment banks in New York, long before becoming the star board member of the NAACP. Du Bois' greatest rival, Marcus Garvey, outright blamed his incarceration on a Jewish conspiracy, accusing Zionist judge Julian Mack, who was the president of the First American Jewish Conference, and prosecutor Maxwell Maddock, with a miscarriage of justice. Quote, Garvey was furious with the verdict, shouting abuse in the courtroom, calling both the judge and the district attorney dirty damn Jews. Imprisoned in the Tombs jail while awaiting sentencing, he continued to blame a Jewish cabal for the verdict. In contrast, prior to this, he had never expressed, quote, anti-Semitic sentiment and was supportive of Zionism. Garvey stated, when they wanted to get me, they had a Jewish judge try me and a Jewish prosecutor. I would have been freed, but 2 Jews on the jury held out against me 10 hours and succeeded in convicting me, whereupon the Jewish judge gave me the maximum penalty, end quote. As far as Du Bois and his relationship with the Zionist board of directors for the NAACP, let's just say things took a turn for the worst. Willie faced some opposition for his description of a specific type of slave trader in the South during his compilation of the Souls of Black Folk. Several times, Du Bois was instructed by his bosses to change the word Jew to immigrant, to which he refused, and he was quickly cut from the team for biting the hidden hand and forced to resign. Walter White, who also passed for the latter, was president of the NAACP at the time of Willie's departure. Willie, who taught 2 of Walter White's older siblings at Atlanta University, now Clark University, was 25 years his senior. Walter White, supposedly of some Negro ancestry, was the bastard grandson of President William Henry Harrison. According to Walter White's oral family history, Harrison decided to give away his bastard slave children to his brother, as it wasn't politically advantageous for a man running for president. While Du Bois was in the NAACP, he joined the Socialist Party of America, but soon withdrew his membership after lobbying for presidential candidate Woodrow Wilson in his 1912 campaign. At this time, Du Bois wasn't officially endorsing communism, but he had been exposed to Marxist philosophy while studying in Germany, but hadn't yet adopted it as his personal philosophy. Instead, he was seen as a socialist or social radical in comparison to his counterpart, Booker T. Washington. In 1931, 9 black teenagers were falsely accused of raping 2 white women in Alabama and were set to go to trial. According to David Levering Lewis, Du Bois and the NAACP thought it would be unadvantageous to support a cause for the defense of the Scottsboro Boys. With the NAACP fumbling the ball, the Communist Party recovered the ball and drafted a Jewish Communist Dream legal defense team that included names like Joseph Brodsky, Irving Schwab, Samuel Leibowitz, Alan Taub, Joseph Tauber, Elias Schwarzbart, Carol Weiss, and Sidney Schreiber.
Holy Jewy!
Along with other Russo-Prussian surnames of a certain origin. The Scottsboro Boys were eventually convicted of rape and sentenced to as much as 99 years in prison. However, most had been released on parole by the mid-1950s. As for the communist influence among indigenous Americans, there was a philosophical split emerging from the left, wherein the NAACP beforehand exemplified the impression of radicalism through their talented 10th ideology, which had no influence among working class Negroes. The Communist Party was looking to fill that void. With the willingness of the Communist Party to challenge the courts on behalf of working class Negroes, the Communist Party began siphoning off the more extreme left of the NAACP's support base. Now, all of a sudden, so-called Negroes were dropping the NAACP and flipping communist. Essentially switching one set of Jews for the other, the Zionists for the communists. A two-headed eagle, or possibly a snake, intrinsically interconnected to one another. As stated earlier, communism created the conditions in Russia for Zionism and the creation of the 1948 nation of Palestinian occupation. The communists were something that the NAACP couldn't be, a white face. No matter how many white faces were behind NAACP decisions, they still had to remain black to the public. The communists had successfully pitted the NAACP against its own interests in its own corner of American philosophy. As stated by David Levering Lewis, the communist leadership used this opportunity to accuse Du Bois of being a class enemy and furthermore claimed the NAACP leadership was an isolated elite, disconnected from the blacks they ostensibly fought for. The communists, for their part, were already taking giant steps to garner community support when, as early as 1932, they accelerated James W. Ford as a vice presidential candidate for the Communist Party USA ticket. Ford had previously been a member of the Negro Labor Congress, a communist organization which targeted Southern blacks moving north during the Great Migration for membership, espousing representation and voter rights and labor conditions primarily. The Negro Labor Congress was founded by Lovett Whiteman, one of, if not the most notorious black communist of the early 20th century.
The document reads, Death Certificate, January 13, 1939. Lovett Fort Whiteman, American, convicted by Special Board of the NKVD of the USSR for anti-Soviet agitation and sentenced to 5 years. Time and place of death, January 13, 1939, at 1 a.m., en route from the infirmary to the hospital. Cause of death, weakening of cardiac activity. Autopsy did not indicate violent death. Lovett Fort Whiteman is the only known African-American victim of Stalin's Great Terror. He was convicted of counter-revolutionary activity in July 1938 and sentenced to 5 years in Sevastlag in Colima. How did a native of Dallas, Texas, and son of a former North Carolina slave wind up a victim of Stalinist violence in Soviet Russia? Born on December 3, 1889, Lovett Fort Whiteman was one of the most important African-American communists in the 1920s. Dubbed the reddest of the blacks by Time magazine in 1925, he was an early communist convert as one of the first African-Americans to join the American Communist Party and national organizer of the American Negro Labor Congress. In a letter signed James Jackson, Fort Whiteman wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois about his time in Russia in 1924.
July 15th, 1924. Dear Sir, this letter comes from a village deep in the heart of Russia. I am an American Negro, a native of the South, here in Russia making a study of social conditions. The above-named village is the seat of the summer of colony of the University for Eastern Peoples located at Moscow. One must visit Russia to understand and appreciate the many beautiful social developments which are taking place in this strange land. Here at this colony are students from all darker races, all except that of the Negro. I am daily asked why no Negroes have come. There is a perfect spirit of internationalism here. Here, life is poetry itself. It is the Bolshevik idea of social relations in a miniature of the world of tomorrow. Very truly yours, James C. Jackson.
Visiting the Soviet Union in 1926, W.E.B. Du Bois himself proclaimed, "If what I've seen with my eyes and heard with my ears in Russia is Bolshevism, I am a Bolshevik." By 1935, there were rumors that Fort Whiteman was trying to leave the USSR illegally. These were followed by a series of denunciation letters written by William Patterson, another African-American communist in Moscow. Patterson would go on to become a prominent participant in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. January 17, 1936. To the Anglo-American Secretariat. Comintern. Comrade Randolph. I do not know of Whiteman's relation with other Negro comrades here. I am, however, of the opinion that something should be done to remove him from the center here, because as soon as new Negro elements come, they are immediately contacted by him, and he endeavors to place them under his influence. Comradely yours, William Patterson. On April 30th, Lovett Fort Whiteman spoke at the Foreign Workers Club. He was supposed to make a review of the recent book of Langston Hughes, The Ways of White Folks. Under cover of reviewing this book, he made a very open attack upon the Comintern position on the Negro question. He has for some years now carried on a persistent agitation among Negroes, who are here as workers and otherwise against the Comintern line. In my opinion, he should be sent to work somewhere where contact with the Negro comrades is impossible. William Patterson. According to Robert Robertson, about 3 weeks after his lecture on Hughes's The Ways of White Folks, Fort Whiteman was summoned to the NKVD, convicted as a counter-revolutionary, and exiled to Kazakhstan. No one ever heard from Fort Whiteman again. Robinson did get some news about Whiteman years later from a man who was in Sevastopol with Whiteman. In 1900, I heard news of Whiteman's fate. A Russian who had been banished to the same town as Whiteman told a friend of mine that Whiteman was assigned to his group of laborers and was severely beaten many times when he failed to meet the norm. He died of starvation or malnutrition, a broken man whose teeth had been knocked out.
Although Du Bois had expressed socialist and even communist sympathies and affinities throughout his career as a Boule boss journalist, he tried to keep a commie coon hair's glare from branding himself with the official sickle. He could sell to Russia and see real communism and end up like Lovett, or curb his subversion and continue giving that Willie tutelage to 20-year-old green-eyed mulattoes who pursue good grades and slob knobs to get recommendation letters for city jobs. For Willie, the choice was simple. He would assert several times, in many ways, in no way, shape, or form was he involved in any commie niggerdom.
Sir, listen, I'm gonna make this clear. I'm in no way, shape, or form involved in any niggerdom. You understand?
The problem was, Du Bois was involved in excessive amounts of commie niggerdom, according to the FBI. Willie was hanging out with all the dope communists, Langston Hughes, Paul Robeson, Russian white bitches, drinking white Russians, straight jet lag on trips to Russia, possibly boat lag, on Russian boats with Russian hoes. And the FBI was straight hating. Willie was indicted for subversive activity along with other colleagues at the Peace Information Center. However, the case was eventually dismissed and Willie was not convicted of espionage. But his passport was taken, leaving mad, disappointed bitches in Lithuania.
Damn, it looked like Paul got all the Russian hoes. Leave some for Willie, Paul. Leave some for Willie.
Around the same time, after the end of the Second World War, known as the Red Scare, tensions were heightened due to widespread Cold War anti-communist sentiment and rumors of the Soviet Union using American citizens as agents of counterintelligence.
This is Movie Time. Leslie Mitchell reporting. After a 9-month trial, 11 leading United States communists have been found guilty of teaching and advocating the overthrow of the government. The marathon session was presided over by Judge Medina, who must be relieved that his monotonous job has at last come to an end. The 5 defense attorneys are also to go to jail for behavior and tactics amounting to contempt of court. The jury, who at least have had 9 months' work out of it, reached their decision in 7 hours, headed by Mrs. Thelma Dyer. And the prisoners, led by Eugene Dennis, secretary of the American Communist Party, leave the courtroom handcuffed in pairs. They won't be at liberty to do any damage for quite a time to come. America has a way of dealing with those of her nationals who give their allegiance to a foreign power.
The trial of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg brought these tensions to the forefront of the American justice system and its stance on those people it finds to be traitorous. The list of conspirators within the Rosenberg spy ring include Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Julius being from a family of Jewish Russian immigrants born in New York City, where he met Ethel Greenglass, a Jewish girl from Manhattan, and they got married in 1939. Julius was recruited by high-ranking members within the Soviet Communist Party when he was an engineer for the Army Signal Corps and when the Soviets and the U.S. were allies. He later recruited Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, who was actually working on the Manhattan Atomic Project at the time. As well, others included Harry Gold, a Swiss-born American chemist, Klaus Fuchs, a German physicist, Morton Sobel, an American engineer, and Theodore Hall, an American physicist.
David Greenglass claimed to have sketched the Nagasaki bomb's inner workings for Julius. His sister Ethel was said to have typed out his 10-page description. Within 2 years of the end of the war, relations between the victors had deteriorated so much that the Russians blockaded Berlin. The Allies responded with an airlift, which kept the non-communist part of the city alive. As an iron curtain fell across Europe, the Yakolev network ceased operation. The Western Allies now prepared to resist communism, and general anti-communist feeling in America increased as the Chinese communists, led by Mao Zedong, took control of that vast country. Then, on the 23rd of September 1949, the Russians detonated their first atom bomb. This was 3 years earlier than the West had expected, and the members of the dispersed spy ring knew it could only have come about so soon through their efforts. Once again, American troops poured across the ocean, and the anti-communist feelings of the American people deepened as they saw their troops dying again. In the midst of this new mood, Julius Rosenberg was arrested on the 17th of July and Ethel on the 10th of August. Another courier in the Yakolev spy ring, Morton Sobel, fled to Mexico but was brought back. All three stood trial for conspiracy to commit espionage. David Greenglass and Harry Gold pleaded guilty and agreed to give evidence, so were not tried with them. In return for also giving evidence against the Rosenbergs, Ruth Greenglass was not prosecuted at all. In March 1951, the trio pleaded not guilty at New York's federal courthouse. The most telling evidence against them came from David Greenglass and his wife Ruth. David testified that his sister typed his analysis of the atom bomb, which Julius had called very good. Julius denied everything. He didn't know where David was stationed. He had never given him money or seen his sketch of the bomb. Ethel testified that everything her brother and his wife had said was false. She was a loyal citizen. Harry Gold gave evidence that he picked up envelopes from Fuchs and the Greenglasses in New Mexico. He told David that Julius sent me and received what Greenglass called the secret of the atom bomb. The Rosenbergs' attorney, Emanuel Bloch, inexperienced in criminal cases, presented what was, by general consent, a poor defense. In contrast, prosecutor Irving Sapol impressed the jury with his charge that the Rosenbergs have magnified their treachery by lying here. On the 29th of March, after one night of deliberation, the jury found the Rosenbergs and Sobel guilty of conspiring to commit espionage. Judge Irving Kaufman told the Rosenbergs, "Your conduct in putting the A-bomb into the hands of the Russians has already caused the communist aggression in Korea." He sentenced them both to death in the electric chair and went on, somewhat wildly, "I believe your conduct has already caused 50,000 casualties in Korea, and who knows but that millions more innocent people may pay the price of your treason." At Sing Sing prison, all the preparations had been made for the execution. It had been brought forward from the usual hour of 11 o'clock to 8 p.m. so as to avoid the Jewish Sabbath. A rabbi arrived to give final words of comfort and prayer. State troopers barricaded all entrances. The offer of a reprieve for a confession still applied, and a telephone line was kept open for any news that the couple had accepted the deal. A prison matron revealed that Ethel refused to believe she was going to die and still insisted her innocence. Because of the change in time, there was to be no last meal of their choice. The 5 permitted witnesses arrived. They were the U.S. Marshal and his deputy, and 3 journalists, one from each of the main wire services. 35 other newspapermen awaited their reports in another room. In New York's Union Square, the crowds gathered in one last mass protest. For many, the question now is not whether the couple were guilty, but whether they deserved to die after a trial conducted in such an hysterical atmosphere. At the prison, Julius and Ethel were saying a last farewell to each other. As the clock overlooking the square moved past the hour of execution, several women in the crowd fainted, and both men and women were not ashamed to weep. Julius had been the first to go into the death chamber. He had to be helped to the chair, but died swiftly once the switch was pulled. But when Ethel's turn came, it took 4 long shocks before the doctor pronounced her dead.
A common thing among communists, other than the obvious ethnicity, was atheism. Within communist philosophy, there was no room for religion or extra room for property, food, or shelter without the government deciding everyone's fair share. As opposed to socialism, where the government controls major industry, people can still own personal property and religious freedom is tolerated. The socialist ideology was conceived as a bridge between capitalism and communism. But practically speaking, how could one own anything if everything you own is limited by the government? At a certain point, even a person's thoughts become property of the state, eminent domain, a free distribution of your contribution without restitution. The elimination of free speech and personal protection. The line between communism and universal slavery is a thin one indeed. Over the past century, a certain group of people have gone to excessive lengths to deny their involvement in the slave trade. According to several scholars, these select people have minimal involvement in slavery or the slave trade in general. And any suggestion otherwise should be considered hate speech. It has often been quoted that these people, if they had actually owned a slave, in practice treated their slaves better than their average white Christian counterparts. Moreover, several organizations have funded research specifically designed to justify this position, that if any Sephardim or Ashkenazim had participated in the institution of slavery, it was par for the colonial course. In the chapter, Judaism in the Antebellum South, Jason Silverman writes, Quote, "For those Jews who did own slaves, the records demonstrate that they were not significantly different from other slave masters in their treatment of their bondsmen. Southern Jews were just as likely or unlikely to manumit their slaves, and if their last wills and testaments were indicative, Jews occasionally regarded their slaves as chattel to be retained if possible, or to be sold if the situation warranted. Incidents of cruel, sadistic, or violent Jewish slave owners are rare, in part because such episodes generally occurred in the rural South, where few Jews resided. A few Jews even became prominent slave-owning planters in the South. Judah P. Benjamin, master of the New Orleans plantation Belle Chase and its 140 slaves, was virtually an icon of the Southern gentleman and plantation owner. Major Raphael J. Moses owned a plantation with approximately 50 slaves near Columbus, Georgia. South Carolinians Nathan Nathans, Isaiah Moses, Mordecai Cohen, Isaac Lyons, Barrett Cohen, and Chapman Levy all maintained sizable slaveholdings, and various members of the Mordecai family owned Virginia and North Carolina plantations. Yet it must be remembered that as successful as these Jewish Southerners were by Southern standards, they represented a very tiny percentage of the 20,000 Jews residing in the antebellum South who could or would ever aspire to own a slave. About 5,000 Jews owned one or more slaves, about 1.25% of all the slave owners in the antebellum South. End quote. Judaism in the antebellum South. Jason Jewishman. In this passage, Silverman concedes some level of participation by Jews within the slave trade, but injects a telling caveat into the nature of his purpose, while relating that a tiny percentage of Jews in the South owned a slave. He then goes on to say that only around 1.25% of all slave owners in the South were Jews. In the meantime, glazing over his presented statistic asserting that a quarter of Southern Jewry were slave owners. He uses the amount of total slave owners in the South to deflect from his statistical switcheroo. During this time in the antebellum South, Jews were less than 1% of the entire population. By some estimates, including Silverman's, 20,000 in the ambiguous South, which from 1815 to 1860 had an estimated population of over 4 million people, making this group a tiny percentage of the overall population to boot, around 0.5%. Yet, we're still 1.25% of slave owners in the South. Instead of using the more transparent statistic of 25% of Southern Jews owned slaves, he states only 1.25% of Southern slave owners were Jews. A blatant statistical conflation arranged in course to undersell the prior information. Quote from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. Professor David Breon Davis. That can't be right. David Davis? Okay, all right. Quote, Professor David Breon Davis, Yale University, in Slavery and Human Progress in reference to slavery in Brazil. Quote, Jews had no major or continuing impact on New World slavery. End quote. The first synagogue in the Americas was built in Recife, Brazil, in 1636. According to American author Adam Smith in his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, he states Portuguese Jews built a Brazilian sugar empire. The question is, off the backs of whom? Ironically, the book Jews in Colonial Brazil records the rich history of secret Jews, known in the book as New Christians, from their earliest recorded dates of immigration to Brazil, beginning in the early 1500s. In reference to slavery in Brazil or anywhere in the Americas, this statement is explicitly false. Another interesting quote happens to be on page 27 of this book. Jews in Colonial Brazil by Arnold Wisnitzer. Quote, several references to Jews occur in the Dialogos. Brandonio is of the opinion that the Brazilian Indians were descendants of Israelites. He believes that during a 3-year absence with the fleet of King Hiram, some of the ships of the Tarshish fleet of King Solomon, driven by storms, accidentally landed on the coast of Brazil, and that the crew of those vessels remained there while the rest of the fleet returned from Ophir to Israel, carrying a cargo of gold, silver, ivory, monkeys, and parrots. The port of Ophir, according to Brandonio, was located in Tharsis, possibly Tarshish, on the western coast of Africa, near the city of São Jorge. Brandonio holds that the crew members who remained in Brazil were the ancestors of the Brazilian Indians. Alviano responds that barbarians like the Brazilian Indians could not be descendants of Israelites. If they were, he argues, they would have inherited some of the Israelites' cultural traditions. Brandonio reports that the loss of such traditions could be ascribed to the long period of time that had elapsed since the old Israelites' arrival in Brazil. In a remote land without scriptures, they had lost memory of the culture of their ancestors and had become barbarians. Moreover, he argued, the Brazilian Indians used many Hebrew concepts and allusions. For example, they practiced the custom of accepting their nieces as their true wives. They had knowledge of the stars, although they called them by other names. He adduced other evidence to prove that the Brazilian Indians were descendants of the Israelites who were first to navigate the surrounding seas. End quote. From Jews in Colonial Brazil. And of course, this legend would correspond exactly to the Parihaba stone found in Brazil at that exact location, with the inscription that traces to the architect of Solomon's temple and the most revered figure in Freemasonry, King Hiram. Bertram Korn, a decorated Navy rabbi, states all the Jewish slave traders in all the southern states and towns combined did not buy and sell as many slaves as did the firm of Franklin and Armfield, the largest Negro traders in the South. Once again, another deceptive quote used to disregard a fact with an irrelevant counterpoint, using Franklin and Armfield as the cornerstone of their premise. Franklin and Armfield was created in 1828, 20 years after the Atlantic slave trade ended by law, which means the approximately 400,000 so-called Africans brought to North America came before the creation of Franklin and Armfield, who was no doubt trading in Americans captured in the War of 1812. Franklin and Armfield played the predominant role in the intra-American slave trade, uprooting people and families from tobacco plantations in Virginia and displacing them on cotton plantations in the Deep South. Having operations in Alexandria, Virginia, New Orleans, and Natchez, Mississippi, and apparently zero Jewish connections. Jewish scholar Seymour Drescher states, Jews rarely established new slave trade routes because they had all the old ones, they're really good ones. Never mind. But rather worked in conjunction with a Christian partner. I see no deflection here, nor any pattern of deflection throughout the material. And any recognition of such deflection is 5 to 18 years of penal subjection, especially in Brazil. But I digress. Nonetheless, these select historians often include mentions of Christians participating in the same practice, not as a deflectionary tactic, but an honest presentation of unbiased information. Yeah. Completely omitting the fact that the so-called Christians being indicted in many of these studies are in reality secret Jews masquerading as Christians. Take James the Wolf, for example. He and his family are responsible for the deportation of over 11,000 captives. Literally 2.75% of the entire transatlantic North American slave trade was funded through his enterprise. But to simply ask if he was Jewish means to blur the semantical line between truth and fiction, again conflating supposed ethnicity with religion, creating a loophole for dishonest historians to mitigate evidence into auspicious byproducts of hypothetical scholarship.
You're not free. 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 You're not free.
The story of slavery in America is not as black and white as we were taught to believe. Along with the blurred lines between race, the reclassification of captured indigenous Americans into so-called African slaves only further complicated the blurred line between races. It should be stated as fact that every so-called black person wasn't a slave, nor was every so-called white person a slave owner. There were even so-called white slaves or indentured servants. Indeed, as late as 1860, there were as many as 3,000 so-called black slave owners in America. The majority of African slaves brought to North America happened between 1750 and 1808. After the War of 1812, the black population in the South jumped to 4 million, a figure indicative of a large number of post-war captives already held in bondage. Prior to the year 1800, it would be a complete fallacy to assert that Dutch, Germans, Huguenots, Moors, and Marranos, otherwise known as crypto-Jews, didn't play a significant role in the enterprise of the slave trade or slave labor, along with the more clearly defined sects of Ashkenazim and Sephardim. As documented in the earliest voyages, Sephardic Jews were the first Europeans in America, even before the influx of Christians. Most of those who left Europe were fleeing Inquisition in 1491, so it should be no surprise that some of the oldest colonial cities in America were first settled by Sephardic Jews. And it also shouldn't come as a surprise that these cities were built upon the back of an entire slave economy, many of them being operated from the Caribbean and thus not included in studies targeting American slave owners. However, American cities like Newport, Rhode Island, New Orleans, Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina were dominant slave merchant ports in North America. They were also the cities with the most significant Jewish populations as well. This point is only a matter of sheer coincidence, and it would be anti-Semitic to suggest otherwise. To say that the majority of Jews participated in the slave trade is false. It would be more accurate to say that a disproportionate amount of Jews participated in the slave trade, as in comparison to the average citizen. Be all this as it may, these people were not disproportionate in their support for the abolition of slavery, which was a far more disproportionately Christian implementation. The old families of colonial jewelry had been established centuries before the Emancipation Proclamation and had no public inclination to turn their cheeks away from the profits generated by free labor. One could even argue that the abolition of slavery was a Christian-backed ploy to level the playing field between the have and the have-nots. But even after the abolition of slavery, indigenous Americans were being exploited in a system of debt peonage. According to Du Bois, one such case of many included a Russian Jew in Georgia who finessed black sharecroppers out of land and into perpetual servitude. It is only fitting that communism is a product of the same bloodline. What we haven't mentioned are the Freemasons and their role in the institution of slavery. Maybe we'll actually get to that on the next episode of Boule.